Today, we are joined by Louis Bickford, Mindstory and Memria CEO, and Nicolette Naylor, Ubuntu Global Philanthropy and Gender Justice Founder CEO. They bring decades in NGO sustainability and will share ARC's Roundtable lesson on diversified funding and non-financial resourcing. Also, Meryl Sovner, as mentioned, will support on chat if you have any questions during their presentation. So with that, I welcome you, Nicolette and Louis, to stage.
Thank you so much, Robin, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Nicolette Naylor, calling in from Cape Town, South Africa today. We're really excited to see how many people RSVP'd for the session. We thought we may have 5 people that would be interested in the topic, so it's really great to see the levels of interest. It says something about the moment we are in, perhaps. And this theme as a topic for 2025, it seems to be lots of webinars, conferences, things around the topic of alternative resourcing. Our goal for today is really to hopefully inspire all of you by sharing a bit about ARCS. And the acronym stands for Alternative Resourcing for Change and Solidarity Roundtable, which we really see as a collective endeavor to reimagine human rights and social justice NGOs of the future, with a specific focus on resourcing for the sector. And Louis and I are going to be in a bit of a conversation with each other as we explore the problem as we see it and talk a bit about the offering, what ARCS is hoping to offer. And then we really want to hear from all of you, particularly around why you decided to register for this, what was interesting about this topic that made you want to join, what you're hoping to get out of it, and also to just get some feedback on what we're going to share. So we're looking forward to spending the next 55 minutes with you. For now, I'm going to hand over to my co-conspirator, Louis Bickford. Over to you, Louis.
Great. Yes, again, thank you all for being here. It's a great combination of people, and we see a lot of people we know and a lot of people we don't know, and a lot of real experts in the room too on exactly this topic who've been working on it for years, and we recognize that expertise for sure, and we hope that you'll join in, and some of you have already been involved in our conversations. So let's start at the beginning. NGOs. NGOs are not a divinely ordained organizational form. Right? This is there's a historical trajectory here that's actually pretty fascinating, which is in the early part of the 20th century, there were very few NGOs. One count puts it at in 1914, there were 500,000. By the time we get to today, we've got something like 10 million NGOs globally. And in terms of international NGOs, again, there were a handful, few dozen around after the turn of the century, after the First World War. Now there are 47,000 by one count. So this incredible boom of NGOs really begins, as many of us remember, in the 1980s and 1990s. And philanthropy plays this very important role here. And philanthropy sees NGOs as a kind of panacea, a kind of way to help solve problems, and encourages the formation of NGOs, puts a lot of money into NGOs. NGOs are very willing partners. A lot of them are founded in different waves of founding of NGOs up through the 2010s and 2020s even. But that number is drooping off in terms of new NGOs being founded now. And long before the current spending cuts, which propel these questions into a kind of salience and urgency, but long before this, there have been critiques and discussions about the NGO foundation or government dependency problems. People will remember that book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. That's now 10 or 15 years old. Been discourses around decolonizing philanthropy. So there's a lot that's been going on this long before the big spending cuts. But again, the big spending cuts have propelled this into a new urgency. And we believe that we're on the brink of a kind of Kuhnian paradigm shift here. that it's very analogous to the 1980s or 1990s when NGOs took off as a kind of new organizational form. We believe that we're in a kind of paradigm shift right now that has been a long time coming, but is really now accelerating. And we want to ask that question: what will this new form or these multiple new forms look like? And there are so many experiments that have happened to draw on. Some of this is not so brand new at all. And again, we recognize that those many experiments. I just want to acknowledge a couple of those that are, some of them in the room, some not. Point people to the Rights Collab, Mapping Civil Society Innovation. We're going to put some of these in the chat. The FIRE program and Spring Strategies, which a number of you are alumni of, and the founder and both, I believe that both executive directors are in the room. The work of the BUILD program at Ford, the Gender Funders Collab, Weaving Resilience, Human Rights Funders Network. All of these, Humentum, we put ourselves in this kind of wave of very exciting initiatives that are going forward to reimagine civil society and think about new organizational forms or new ways of achieving mission that go into the next period. Over to you, Nicolette.
Thanks, Louis. And I think I'd add here that the current moment and the current crisis that we're in really shows us that we can't adopt a business as usual approach to our work. I think the world is a very different place, and this moment has forced many civil society organizations and philanthropic foundations to confront some uncomfortable questions like, who are you and how are you positioned politically in this moment? Whose interests are you serving? How do you remain relevant? And in this moment, institutional relevance is not a given. It must be continuously examined and actively earned. What does legitimacy look like when political lines are sharpening, financial resources are decreasing, at a time that authoritarianism is on the increase and the civic space is narrowing? And how do you stay focused on mission and purpose in climates of scarcity? So for me, I come into this with a question: the house is on fire. Do we fix it? Do we leave it to burn down? Or do we rebuild it? And I think the moment requires courage and imagination. And we all have agency in this moment. We're not just objects that this is being done to. We have agency to ask some questions around what needs to die, what needs to be given birth to, what has been our greatest contribution, what did we get wrong? And are we able to offer a vision for the future, or do we have a vision for the past? Because I think this isn't just a crisis of democracy. It's really a test of our sector's capacity to evolve structurally, not just rhetorically. And I think there's real tensions around the willingness to evolve and how quickly to evolve. And it's important, I come into this really by thinking about the politics of the work and cultures of dependence versus independence and autonomy. There's a lot of conversation around sustainable funding. I like to ask, what does independent autonomous funding look like, where you have complete independence and autonomy to do, if you want to engage in civil disobedience or storm parliament, you have the autonomy and the independence to do that without being told you are contravening a clause in a contract. And when we think about the structure of organizations and how change is happening today in many parts of the world, from Nepal to Madagascar to Kenya, do we start with resources or do we start with creativity? Is the human rights movement building a revolution or an organization? Because I think strategies for revolution versus strategies for fundraising are very different. Where citizens are rising up in anger and revolt, they're not waiting for a funding proposal to come through to effect change. And so how tied are we in the human rights sector to funding proposals versus constituency level mass mobilization of people? I spoke to a social movement leader in South Africa, and he said to me, we are very well resourced, not in terms of money, but in terms of 10,000 members and mass-based support in the community we serve. We are very well resourced in terms of trust and legitimacy. But we have a very small budget, and we don't take money from any funders outside of the community or the country. So by US standards, we're not well resourced, but by African solidarity standards, we're very well resourced. I get excited by this kind of reimagining about resourcing and what does alternative resourcing for the human rights sector look like. And these are the kinds of conversations that I think we need to be having, that's grounded in the politics of the moment and the solidarity that we require in this moment. So let's talk a bit about what ARCS has to offer. Louis.
Sorry, I had muted. So yeah, we have to be honest with you that we are in an early stage of developing this. We are building the plane as we're flying it. And actually, that's it, somewhat on purpose. In other words, this is a co-created endeavor. We're not building this by ourselves. We've already started having many conversations with many of you, actually, and many others. We want to continue to have those conversations and find a way to identify exactly the added value of ARCS. Or the ARCS Roundtable is our formal name. Let me just run through a couple of things that we've decided we are. The first is we are looking at social justice and human rights NGOs. Now, we are actually looking at formal NGOs. So we're very aware that there are multiple different forms of social movement actors, civil society organizations, grassroots organizations, protest movement organizations, or assemblies of different kinds. But we're very interested in this question of the NGO as an organizational form working on these particular topics because, frankly, the social justice and human rights sector is behind the curve on this. Economic development actors, health actors, education actors have actually embraced a lot of these kinds of alternative things. And we can learn a lot from those sectors as well. So we're very interested in learning from others who have gone before us who have done this. But our suggestion here is that the social justice, human rights NGO universe is a little behind on thinking through these things, and for some good reasons. Some of these things are extremely difficult to monetize. They're very difficult to measure. There's a lot of skepticism out there, and we may hear it on this call where we welcome the skepticism and criticism of these things. One of our close friends we were talking to, and she said, I'm sick of everyone telling me I need to be a social enterprise. Why do I have to be a social enterprise? We get it. You don't have to be a social enterprise, but the thing is, there is at least one very dire prediction out there that I've seen that 20 to 40% of NGOs will either vanish or merge within the next 5 to 10 years. Now, I don't know if that's true, and the merger question is super hot potato, but nonetheless, it may not be a question of, gee whiz, should we do something? It may be a question of do or die, because some of these are very dire questions. So that's one thing we are. Another thing we are is cross-sectoral, but I'll let Nicolette talk a little more about that. Second thing is philanthropy and NGOs and consultants. Now, we recognize, again, it's very difficult to get philanthropy in the same room we've both been on both sides, multiple sides of these tables, and we know that this is difficult. So we're trying to take some measures to flatten it a little bit, to make it more peer-led, thinking of things like first names only, leave your organization at the door, don't come in representing your institution, Chatham House rule. We're working through a lot of those kinds of things, and we will have some larger offerings like this, which are public facing, but we'll also have many smaller things. And some of you we've spoken to already about some of this much, much smaller, more intimate roundtable kind of gatherings. Coalition of the Willing, Nicolette, it's one of your favorite topics, and I love it too. So let me pass that over to you. But the last thing I'll say is that we really do hope to attract, I just saw Ellen, I was about to mention Ellen. We really do want to attract alumni from some of the great programs or participants in some of the great other programs we've mentioned. So we've already talked to people who've gone through the FIRE program, Spring Strategies. They have found that to be incredibly valuable, and also like the idea of participating in a roundtable like this. We really very much welcome people who are involved in analogous and related efforts around the world. Nicolette?
I always say that talking about what you are, you should also talk about what you're not. And so I think it may be helpful to say what the space is not. I think ARCS is not about a quick fix solution. We don't have answers. We don't claim to be experts. We believe in generative organic spaces that generate multiple possible ways of thinking about the issue of alternative resourcing that's very much peer-led by those doing the work on the ground. And we recognize and value the fact that many organizations are currently organizing discussions on this topic, but it's often secondary to your core mandate and your core mission. So often the human rights organizations, we have to think about alternative resourcing, but our core mission is we're dealing with torture or we're dealing with genocide, and now we have to think about this. ARCS is, we see ourselves as a centralized resource and a space for reimagining and dreaming. And so we're not a toolbox or a capacity building space. So if you're wanting a space, it's not a space to say, this is how to write a funding proposal. This is how, if you want to, like the status quo, we want to get more money. We want to understand the new president of the Ford Foundation. We want to get Mackenzie Scott money. This is not that kind of space. It's really about how to reimagine and inspire some different ways of thinking about resourcing. So it's not about just writing your proposal or coming up with a good proposal for current funders. We view resourcing, and you would have heard me say this earlier, as more than money. And I think that's a critical point, and it's in our name as well, around solidarity. So we've not focused on just raising more money as a single imperative, but really thinking about resources in terms of time, space, solidarity, mutual connection, where resources are there to drive mission, and resources can be more than just dollars that drive the mission of organizations. On the Coalition of the Willing, we try to pull together people that are interested in having these kinds of conversations and reimagining resourcing. We know there's a lot of skeptics out there that say, look, human rights organizations are always going to need the few US funders and European funders that fund human rights work. There's no other way of doing this work. We're looking for people who are saying, we're interested in blowing up that whole model. The model is broken. Let's think about different ways. But when we say Coalition of the Willing, we at the same time, we're not an echo chamber. We envisage a space of vigorous debate and very different ideological perspectives on the politics of what this looks like and how it might unfold. And we welcome that. We're not focused on a single sector or single geography, and we recognize that there's spaces for gender groups, feminist groups, LGBT groups, climate groups that are meeting and strategizing around resourcing, or at a regional level or country level, people are meeting to strategize. We think a broad tent approach, bringing together social justice organizations across sectors and across geographies, is critical in this moment to foster more solidarity at a time we're in a climate where there's scarcity and where you're seeing a pitting of groups against each other in this climate of scarcity. So how do we foster a climate of abundance and solidarity where you're not pitting Africa against the US in terms of don't fund them, fund us, or don't fund the climate work, fund the gender work. So that's why we think there's going to be some value, but also some tension in bringing groups from across different sectors together. So that's what we're not. We want to just turn to, and then we're going to open it up to all of you to hear from all of you. But we wanted to talk a little bit about what does this look like and what are we starting to think about when we talk about this? Because you know that word innovation, it's such a difficult word to get your head around. But we can problematize innovation. But how do we want to think about innovative approaches to sustainability? Louis, talk a bit about how we're thinking about this, and please put your questions in the chat. We're going to open up for Q&A soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also encourage people to put not just questions. I've seen one or two coming through. Let us know who you are and what why and how you might be interested in this, or any thoughts you have about the effort. Again, we're at quite an early stage and we welcome as much input as we can get. We do believe there are opportunities here, and a lot of these are available on, I think if you Google list of alternative revenue strategies, you'll find a lot of these. So they're out there. There are a lot of blog posts and great articles about these. But what we'd like to do that we hope added value here is really bring in some concrete examples of these that could help to provide some actionable insight for organizations that are actually thinking about some of this stuff. And not just organizations, as I said before, also philanthropy. This is really a conversation that spans both, and ways in which the philanthropic sector can contribute to new infrastructure or new incentives, or has already made those contributions, is an important part of it. So let's start with social enterprise and revenue diversification. Again, people are maybe sick of hearing of this to a certain degree. I come to this personally as somebody who has started a social enterprise that has achieved some success and is doing fine. It was complicated. It was hard to do, and it continues to be hard to do. But there are lessons learned from that. And did it shift the mission a little bit of what I was trying to do originally? It did. And so that's complicated. But nonetheless, there's an organization called Memoria.org that I started that is a viable, ongoing concern and seems to be doing well. And so I bring that as one of many examples. And revenue diversification. Another example is an organization on whose board I sit is seeking to monetize a program that is currently existing and very powerful and works very well. That program, in terms of achieving mission, they're trying to monetize that to bring in, in fact, have started to monetize that to bring in additional revenue. So these kinds of examples would be the things we'd bring into the roundtable conversation. Impact investing and blended finance, more buzzwords, we're aware, and this is also really hard to get impact investors to come into this space, into the social justice, human rights. We have difficult metrics. We don't have the same deliverables. We get it. It's really hard, but there are some interesting examples. And here again, I would point you to the Rights Collab project mapping civil society innovation. And there's some great examples there. Simplifica in Colombia, Justice Text in California, AfriPads in Uganda, others. Again, opportunities to hear from them and bat around some ideas and try and figure out ways, again, for people who are interested, and this is the Coalition of the Willing idea, people who are genuinely interested in trying to push this in their own organization or their own philanthropic strategy push this ball down the field. Strategic partners and mergers. Okay, mergers. Boy, I'm on the board of an organization, another organization that the merger conversation came up. It was triggered by a conversation with a foundation, and boy, were they pissed off about it. They said, no, we don't want to merge. Why would we want to merge? We have nothing to do with these other organizations, blah, blah, blah. And they're right. They're totally right. We recognize that. The thing is, this is a dire moment. And so at least some form of back office collaboration, cost saving, et cetera. And these are things that indeed are being done and tried. And we want to bring those in. And the possibility of mergers. And of course, I maybe we do have somebody from Candid on the call. The biggest merger in this space, in this broader space that I know of, is the Candid GuideStar merger, which costs money. And that's another place where philanthropy might be involved, is helping to allow for mergers to happen. And then another one, and actually Archana speaks, she's on the call, I believe, and speaks extremely eloquently on this topic, but others do too, is new communications strategies and narrative development. It could be the problem. One of the biggest problems here is an ability to communicate with constituencies and bring in kind of memberships and communities into the work that's being done. And again, it's not a new conversation, and there are some really interesting developments out there. I think Rogue Union, which has just launched, is a very good source of information and ideas about this. Thomas Coombs and who calls himself the Hope Guy. There are a lot of others. And of course, Spring Strategies as well, which I've already mentioned. So these are some of the kinds of nuts and bolts things that we want to bring into these roundtable conversations, and some more as well.
Thanks, Louis. And I think there's often tension around the language we use and the semantics we use that sounds very commercial, whether it's social enterprise, impact investing, mergers. How do we apply social justice, human rights principles and reimagine it so that it is more politically grounded in a human rights narrative? Or is it stuff that we're just going to say we need to dismiss it, we need to problematize it, and we can't use it? Or do we reimagine so that it is grounded in the kind of purpose and mission that we think our work is all about? I'm quite interested in, and you can see a theme here whenever I've been speaking, mutual aid and solidarity economics that really represents a return to community-based resource sharing, and models that actually prioritize horizontal relationships and collective ownership over the hierarchical donor-recipient dynamics. And I think organizations, shout out to A-Word, I see you put some resources for us, but organizations like the Black Feminist Fund have demonstrated how solidarity economics can create more equitable and resilient funding structures. in a way that's not just about, because often mutual aid, people say, oh, it's for service organizations or community organizations that aren't doing the political work. And I think we saw a lot of mutual aid groups and community-based organizations during COVID-19. What can we learn from that model in terms of, there's a growing literature now that's documenting how community mobilization and mutual aid is actually improving access, trust, and is actually building legitimacy in communities. And early in 2025 now, when we had the announcements around USAID, you saw organizations again coming together to share bridge funding, seconding staff, co-hosting compliance work, pooling procurement. And I think this is promising for us to learn from as a human rights sector. It was very much driven in the development sector and the CBO sector. And I think we have something to learn there that we'd like to explore. The other piece that I think is interesting for us to think about is constituency and social base building, which I spoke about earlier, how to tap into local resources and actually strengthen your constituency through your work. A lot of the human rights organizations have become a lot more accountable and see their constituency as their donors versus the constituency as the people that you're serving. And we think programs like Civicus's Resilient Roots and Stronger Roots program in Central Eastern Europe show how organizations can cultivate a community around the NGO. And this relationship between communities and NGOs that really builds on building a constituency is important. I think there's also examples on the continent here where you have social movements relying on public interest law organizations to represent them in times of arrest or civil disobedience. And you have similar building of community between movements, human rights, legal organizations, which is cultivating membership structures and more of a social base, building a social base, and seeing that as an effective resource. I spoke to a leader of an Egyptian NGO who said they changed their entire thinking around serving constituencies and communities and building that base. And with that has come many resources because they've pivoted towards looking at that. As you can see on this call, we've been putting a lot of things in the chat. We see ourselves as just being a bridge and a table to bring interesting people around the table to come and talk about these things. As I said, we're not the experts. We're wanting to bring practical examples where people can say, we tried this, it was a disaster, it did not work, it's not replicable, do not try it at home. Or this was really interesting, this is what we learned. And we want to be that kind of resource to people and then facilitate conversations where we can dig deeper into what we're learning. So I saw people saying thank you for the resources, and I think that's something we do see that there's a need for that. But we also see all of you on this call as a significant resource, and that's the idea behind having peer-led conversations. So we really want to open this up to all of you right now for comments and questions, and we'd love to hear from you. Why did you sign up for this event? What are you looking for in these conversations? Because I sometimes go to a conversation and I'm like, is this what I signed up for? Where's their gap? What are you missing when you're going to these conversations? There's a lot of conversations out there. And your honest insights on what ARCS is trying to do. We building the plane as we're flying it, and we relying on a lot of advisors. Many of our advisors are on this call. Shout out to our advisors. And so we're just gathering input, and we're going to learn and try and fail. So we'd love to hear from all of you in terms of what you're learning, what you're seeing, and what you're wanting. So I'm going to open it up, and Meryl, our network manager, is with us. I see Jabu is, oh, hi, Jabu. Nice to see you on the call. Do you want to ask your question, Jabu?
Hi everyone. Thanks for a great session. Yeah, I guess the interchangeable words that we are hearing in this moment or this year is around adaptation, how organizations need to adapt to the funding crisis. And then, of course, this idea that social enterprise will save us all. So I'm just wondering, are there any like resource work around this kind of conversation around one adaptation from NGO to social enterprise, or are they two distinct things? And any particular resources around social enterprise should organizations want to think about a reimagination of their existence around that. I like this idea of NGOs or movements being shrouded around communities. And I think the last question I quickly have is just when we're talking in this broad sense about movements and organizations, do we have some kind of intersectional framework around class, geographies, race, migration, ableism, just a wide range of issues that kind of intersect that impacts on resourcing as well. Thank you.
Let's collect a bunch of, yeah.
So thanks, Jabu. Shall we go to Anna, to Sue? I think it was Sue first, and then Anna. And let's take 3 questions now, and then we'll do another round.
Thanks so much, Nicolette and Louis. Nice to see you on my screen, and lovely to see Meryl and a bunch of people I know from my Open Society Foundation days. I am Yvonne. I'm based in Washington, D.C., she, her pronouns, and I currently work on developing the global strategy for Malala Fund, which is Malala Yousafzai's organization that she founded. And we basically make grants to groups on the front lines that dismantle barriers to girls' education. And you're asking me why I came to this. Maybe I'm one of the few people who's not completely depressed these days. I think disruptions actually give us a moment for revolution. And as painful as the USAID cuts have been for people personally and individually, I also think that a lot of foreign assistance was very problematic in the way it was delivered, especially to frontline partners, especially to marginalized communities who didn't have access. So you had the big contractors, and I was also a recipient in another organization of USAID funding. It was very complicated, very bureaucratic, very compliance oriented. And this move towards trust-based philanthropy that some of us have been having now for about 10, 15 years, really. I remember, and Louis, I think you and I spoke, I was leading this portfolio on local resource mobilization and building constituencies back in the day. And then there were changes at OSF, so that portfolio got cut. Was really thinking of how we shift power and resources to groups in the front line. And I think as horrible, and I don't want to minimize the impact of this on our partners, on people who've lost jobs, on all of those things. It's a horrible thing, the way it was done. It was done very bluntly and cruelly. But I do think this is a moment for us to really be hopeful and reimagine what form we need to do the function of social justice work. So whether it's an NGO, whether it's a social enterprise, in my organization right now, we're an intermediary funder. I'm really moving to more trust-based, flexible funding, very much still within the NGO model, but still really thinking about who do we trust? How do we get resources? Having those conversations in donor spaces. And this is the first time I've always felt like an interstitial part of the philanthropic NGO community in terms of like me saying, the groups on the ground know what they need, know what they want. They even know how to mobilize resources if you give them the seed funding for infrastructure. So I think my larger point is I came to this meeting because this is a space of hope. And I think hope is so much what we need right now. I'm not going to use the audacity of hope because I don't like that phrase. It's very American centric, but the revolutionary kind of power of hope. Sorry, that's very long-winded, but I'm really excited that these conversations, more and more of these conversations and spaces, and really excited to see old friends, new friends, really reconceptualizing how we do social change work. How do we resource that? And power, talking about power. Who holds the power of these resources? Not just global North people, many of us who are in this room, but in global majority countries. Are they driving the conversation? Are they making the decisions? And that is really exciting for me.
Thanks, Sue. Anna.
Thank you so much. As I told you in the chat, my name is Ana Maria Gonzalez. I work for the Colombian government. We have an agency that is dedicated to international cooperation, and I was brought in as the crisis strategist for adaptation because I have always been very critical of the traditional funding mechanisms because they, as Sue mentioned, my heart goes to Sue. She said half of what I wanted to say. I'm absolutely not crying about what happened. It was horrible. The situation was horrible for the people, but in terms of the systemic change, I think it was a great opportunity. So I'm here because I wanted to find like-minded people in the world on this moment of rethinking philanthropy and philanthropic relations, because I have been working really hard towards creating space for this in Latin America in Spanish, so that organizations in Latin America stop thinking from scarcity and really know that we are the abundance. No, the global north depends from the global south and so I'm working on that. We had a great event last week where 50 leaders teamed up from 14 Latin American countries in Spanish to foster this. But so I agree with Sue that these are spaces that build hope and that we have each other, right? The like-minded people have each other. We don't know each other probably yet, but we'll find each other. But having said that, I also want to say something about having a collective task. Us, the ones that are here in this call today. And it is from January to April, and I've researched thoroughly and I have made interviews and everything. From January to April, panic went over the philanthropic sector. And that created the peak in donor advised funds opening in the United States. So this is the time in history where there is more money that is already granted into philanthropic, the category. It cannot go back to normal capital because the certificates of donation have already been issued. So those philanthropic funds are there. So two things happened simultaneously during the first trimester of this year. One is that everybody thought that the US government was going to stop endowments and all this. So everybody put the money into the DAF so that they could get the certificate. So that created the peak. And then the other reason why there was a peak is because when the tariff things came up, and all the Bolsa in New York fell, there was a lot of capital gains from March to April. And capital gains in the US are highly taxed. So wealth managers recommended people to open donor advised funds so that they don't get taxed so much. So those two things, and I was given this number by a very trusted fiscal sponsor that has projects from Colombia. She thinks that there can be $750 billion already in philanthropic funds. So I don't think that the problem is lack of money. The problem is that there are forces, the bank forces, that don't want to spend that money. And so my question to this group is, how are we going to put pressure on banks to spend? Because those funds are not from the banks, they are ours. They have to start distributing that, and we have to be stronger, and that has to be our next step in advocacy. They need to spend. They're spending, and they're proudly spending 25% of what they have. And they feel very proud of that number, right? It's ridiculous. So I think that we are like-minded, and we should move our strength and our collaboration and our efforts in that direction. Maybe. Just a thought.
Thank you. Nicolette, are you calling on? I think Yafet was next.
Yeah. Hi, I wasn't sure if I heard. Did you call on me?
Yes, it wasn't very clear though. So thanks for jumping in.
Hi,
Yes.
everyone. Good to be here with you. I guess I have a question that's a bit of a request of ARCs, if this fits into your agenda. And it's about the dynamic between intermediary and public foundations at this moment and like very grassroots work. It comes out of my question comes out of a convening that Madre, my organization, just held with grassroots feminist and LGBT activists from about 20 countries on this question of alternative and autonomous resourcing. And what I think we all know is that the very locally rooted human rights and social justice work is often critical to especially a lot of the stuff that you were describing, Nicolette. And public and intermediary foundations are often like a lifeline to those hyper-local sorts of groups. And foundations like Black Feminist Fund, Madre, like many of the others, including folks on this call, are in this moment of also needing to reinvent ourselves for the same reasons. And so I think the challenge for us is both like keeping our focus on shoring up that capacity at the very local level while we ourselves are having this moment of transformation. And so it's a particular dynamic that feels to me like a bit of a sub conversation to what you're describing. And I know for me, and I think for other colleagues, it would be very helpful to have some dedicated space to do that, because I'm a little bit concerned about some intermediary foundations, to build on your building the plane while flying it metaphor, Louis, having this attitude of we need to secure our own oxygen masks first, which is a variation of a scarcity mentality, right? And so I'd really like us to have a different approach. And there's also the reality of public foundations being in the crosshairs of this moment in a particular way. So thanks for considering that.
Thank you. I think let's take Allwell and Gaston. Hi, Gaston. And then I'm sorry, we have to close so that we can respond. So let's take the last two, and then Louis and I will dive into some responses. This is great. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, Nicolette. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Really delighted to be here. My name is Allwell Ahibe. I am an African fundraising consultant, and it's helping to shift the power to Francophone and Anglophone African NGOs, enabling them to diversify their funding to ensure financial sustainability. So particularly helping them to transition towards corporate sector partnerships and social enterprise models. I will say that the funding squeeze has really hit us very bad across sub-Saharan Africa, particularly for African NGOs. Since January, I have been all over the place helping to support colleagues with trainings, one-on-one support across sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Congo. It's been the same story. Unfortunately, up to 90% of African NGOs were dependent on funding just from governments and also UN agencies. And both of those sources have been really compromised in the last couple of months. And from USAID alone, we lost $12 billion that came to African NGOs last year. So what I am saying thus far is an appetite for wanting to transition to corporate sector partnerships, a real lack of understanding of how that can be done, how we can navigate like this kind of legal challenges around registration. Most of the registration is an either or aspect where you're either registered as a nonprofit or a for-profit. So there isn't like that social enterprise in between where a lot of organizations across Africa could transition to it. Then again, very limited resourcing or understanding really, particularly of corporate partnerships as like an alternative source of resourcing. So it hasn't been something African NGOs have had to do over the last, 40 years. So it's really brand new thinking around how do we look at ourselves, how do we resource internally. So I like what you said, Nicolette, looking at about when you talked about how local constituencies, how we can look at local constituencies across, I guess, across Africa more as some form of donors and rather than just beneficiaries. So how we can tap into that kind of pool to enhance it. So I guess my expectation here is to kind of really hear how folks around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, look leveraging this kind of alternative resourcing models. In what ways in particular we can ensure, because just like the other speakers have said, the sector really was broken, particularly in terms of localization, shift the power, the grand bargain. So hoping to see that even as all of us collectively transition towards alternative models, sub-Saharan Africa or maybe global South NGOs not end up at the bottom, in the bottom pile once again. So how can we do this right now that we all have an opportunity to do it over? And particularly in terms of alternative resourcing, how can we do it right in a way where we actually shift the power eventually and make it a lot closer to the grassroots and ensure that localization is one in which we truly are able to empower organizations at the grassroots to make a lot more impact in that respect. So hoping that we don't end up reinventing the wheel, a way that still serves the unjust power dynamics eventually. So I think my last question would be, I understand that we're looking to share examples of how all these models have worked around the world. And I just would be wondering what kinds of criteria would we use to determine how well these models have worked. Are we looking at, let's say, I don't know, revenue generation? We'll be considering maturation of this alternative resourcing tactics, all of those kinds of things. So it would be interesting to see what we would term as successful alternative resourcing models, and hopefully how I can, for myself, my intention would be to be able to transition that back to clients and other CSOs that I serve on the African continent. Over to you, Louis and Nicolette. Thanks.
Thank you. Gaston.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nicolette and Louis. Great to see you and see you all here. I think answering, Nicolette, to your question why I'm here, we've been talking about this for the last many months, and I think it's a great idea. And I think this kind of space are very important because there is a feeling of urgency, political urgency for the movement to discuss other alternative model of resources. I think more than ever this year, and particularly with the crisis of cooperation, we challenge or we deal with a situation and the discussion that we delayed for 20 years and we didn't want to confront. Actually, all of us, or many, I am from INCLO, International Network Civil and Human Rights Organization, but I've been the director of Center for Legal and Social Studies and Human Rights NGO in Argentina for many years. I am based in Buenos Aires. So I was saying that we knew that there was a political structural problem with the old paradigm, but actually we felt quite comfortable in Dutch model. And we didn't want to confront that at the time that we needed to think alternatively. My question, I agree with all of you have said, Nicolette and Louis. I have a couple of questions. One is, still, I think there is a kind of a paralysis for many actors at the movement that really understand the need of the change, but they cannot move toward that direction. They really, as you say, Nicolette, are instead of starting the discussion about how we change in this starting point, the model, they still trying to keep convincing the donors, the private philanthropic donors from the global north. And I think it's a kind of a cultural problem that we have to challenge. And the second is, what is the role in this transition of the role of the private philanthropy that has been the supporter of the field for the last 40 years? In my own experience at CELS, and actually Helen has been part of it, we had a very quite successful experience in terms of mobilizing local resource in like individual donors campaign. We did it, like we forced it to do it because like overnight a big foundation cut our funding, but actually another important foundation supported us for that transition and actually provide us like an investing money in our budget from zero. In 5 years, we got like 20% of our budget from local resources and individual donors from Argentinian society. But in addition of the economic impact was a huge political impact for CELS at that moment. So my point is, all of us are agreeing in terms of the transition, but this change will take a while. It's a medium and long-term change. But meanwhile, particularly I'm thinking about NGOs and particularly about economic funding and not other resources, as you, Nicolette, mentioned, that I am fully agree that can be even more important than money. But still, money is important. My point, and we have discussed it, we have to use this art space in order to convene and invite the donors to have this horizontal conversation and to discuss with them what their role is in changing this paradigm. Because we are in a moment in which, for example, if one of the main donors is being investigated by the US administration, or the OFAC list that we confronted, the huge problem of the OFAC list with naming 3 organizations from Palestine, that was a huge impact for the movement. So how we move from where we are to the mid and long-term new paradigm in which I think we want to feel much more comfortable, politically speaking. But my question to you is, what we do in the middle? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaston, and thank you, everyone. This has been such a rich conversation. We're running out of time. Time is not our friend, and we do want to respect people's time. I'm going to make 2 or 3 points to summarize, and I've been looking at what people have been putting in the chat as well, and then hand it over to Louis. I do think that, as Sue was saying, and as you saying, Gaston, there is this moment of crisis, but I think we shouldn't romanticize the past. The system was broken before, and I think the system of dependence and this complete dependence on private philanthropy from the global north and from the US to support human rights work versus looking at human rights work being supported by a wide range of sectors, where if the human rights movement died, everyone at local level would be having a heart attack, versus if the human rights movement is dying in many locations today, people are like, so what? The complete dependence into and buying into a patronizing model and buying into a culture of dependency, whether it was from ODA money, USAID funding, or from social justice funders. And so I would like to decenter. I do think the role, I saw Ellen, you were asking about the role of philanthropy, We also need to decenter US philanthropy from the conversation and have a conversation with ourselves and introspect on where is the human rights movement? Who are we and what do we want to be? Do we want to be, because I think our language, there's a political dissonance in terms of where we are and the change we want to achieve, or we're saying we're going to buy into this model with all its conditionalities, because the climate of conditionalities and compliance and how you're going to be getting grants from any US foundation in the future is real. It's real. And so let's have a different conversation. Are we still just focusing on that? Because the 80s was a time when there was a lot of funding, and we still have a form and structure. The form and structure of NGOs have stayed the same. We look and feel like it felt when I joined the sector many decades ago. The same form and structure exists, but the world is completely different. So can't we reimagine what we look like, who we are, what our politics is, and what is our relationship to money? What is our relationship to philanthropy and to governments and to communities? Let's just build on what we've learned from the past around power and privilege and reimagine something different that's not centered on private philanthropy necessarily, or centered on money, or own the fact that we are obsessed about money. And then we have to own that in terms of how we think about money in all spheres, whether it's the corporate sphere, the philanthropy sphere. But we can't have problems with money in one sphere and not have problems with capital in other spheres. Let's have the conversation that we need to have. I'm sorry. We want to collect all your questions and your feedback to us around what you think would be useful for conversations. These are the conversations we want to be having, and you can be in touch with us. Meryl, if you want to put our contact details in the chat. Louis, do you want to say something in the last 60 seconds? I'm sorry, Louis, I was getting...
Just two bullet points. One is that so many good ideas came up, or thoughts and reflections, and we are interested in organizing around each one of those topics. You brought up some, Anna, you brought up some, Ifat brought up some. All of those could be small ARCs roundtables. So we're very interested in pursuing an organizational form that allows for each of those conversations to take place. And the second thing is just to respond to Gaston about philanthropy. Philanthropy has to be a part of this conversation, and we want to try and find a way to make that comfortable for people from philanthropy. Both of us have experience in philanthropy, to come to the table. Okay, there's the music. It's like the Oscars.
Thank you all. We really value the fact that you came out, and please stay in touch with us. Thank you for all of this. It's been really useful.
Thanks, everyone.